You need a brain to live, but how much of that brain do you really need? 90%? 80%? What if I told you that there were people who had only 50% and even less brain matter, and that they were still living normal lives? That's what we'll be talking about today. People who are missing large parts of their brain that, contrary to everything we know, seem to be totally fine. Now, the brain is the most important organ, and despite what you may hear about how much we know about it, there's still quite a lot we don't understand and a lot of misinformation out there. You've probably heard that the brain isn't fully developed until 25 years of age, but this is a myth, and the brain continues to develop and have age-specific topology well into your 60s. Before we get into the cases and the research studies, let's briefly go over a little bit of brain biology to help you get a better understanding of what's happening. The brain is made up of a series of different regions spread out over two hemispheres. Each hemisphere does different things, and this is known as lateralization, with the left hemisphere generally handling language and logic, and the right generally handling emotion and spatial tasks. Each side also handles the opposite side of the body. The front of each hemisphere is known as the frontal lobe, and this is where complex, high-level decision-making is carried out. This region is so important that some studies have even suggested that murderers have less frontal lobe tissue and are therefore unable to weigh the cost of taking a life. Behind the brain is the cerebellum, a region responsible for precise movements and motor control. Next to that is the pons, which connects the brain to the brainstem and is involved in signal relay and all sorts of rhythm control. Despite this localization, the entire brain is constantly communicating with all of its regions for daily life. You may have heard that some people have a dominant hemisphere that influences their personality, with left brain people being logical and right brain people being creative. But this is a common myth, and it has been debunked. Now that's just a brief overview. There are other regions, and the regions I did mention do a lot more, but it should help you to understand how the entire brain works in concert. And therefore, damage to any part of it should have severe consequences. Although that's generally what happens, let's get into cases that defy the norm. Starting with Phineas Gage. Undoubtedly the most famous of these cases, in 1848, while working with a group blasting rock for a railroad, an accidental explosion would send a rod through his skull and into his brain, destroying most of his left frontal lobe. Despite this, he would go on to live a normal life for the next 12 years, before passing away as a result of epileptic seizures. Now, much has been made of this case and the personality changes that Phineas was claimed to have experienced after his injury. Many claim that he became crazy or a vagrant, but this isn't true, and his physician, J.M. Harlow, never reported anything negative about his behavior. He continued to work and live a completely normal life up until a few months before his death, when he started to experience convulsions. Remember that this is a case that happened over 150 years ago, and there's been a lot of false information that has accrued over the years. Next, let's talk about Elise and Martha. Now, Elise was 25 years old and in her first year of graduate school when she would receive an MRI. Doctors would discover that she had a lesion and was missing her left temporal lobe. This series of stacked MRI slices should show you the extent of the brain that she was missing. When doctors saw this, they expected her to have a 5th grade vocabulary and were shocked by her cognitive ability. After all, she was a grad student and had been living a completely normal life. But what makes this case more interesting is her sister, Martha. When she was 17, she had started having vision problems, and her neurosurgeon discovered that she also had a lesion and was missing her right temporal lobe. Two sisters missing opposite parts of their brain and living normal lives provided a very unique opportunity for researchers. And both sisters, as well as another sibling who had a normal brain, would all take part in a research study. In it, all 3 siblings would perform within the normal range on all language and cognitive tests, indistinguishable from the control population. Interestingly, they all had the same level of activity as opposed to past cases of brain trauma where activity increased in other regions to compensate, suggesting that the bilateral auditory systems humans have is for redundancy, and only one auditory cortex may be needed. The next case we'll go into is that of a 44-year-old Frenchman. who in 2007 was discovered to be missing 90% of his brain. He had gone into a local hospital, complaining of a weakness in his legs, and there he would receive a CT and MRI scan, where it was first determined that his lateral ventricles had swollen to gigantic size and were taking up almost all the space where his brain should have been. Apparently, the man suffered from hydrocephalus, a condition where excess cerebrospinal fluid builds up in the ventricles. Although he had a shunt put in as an infant to drain the liquid, it was removed when he was 14, thus leading to the large buildup. Despite all of this, he had been living a completely normal life. He was married and had 2 children, and was working as a civil servant. Later testing would show that he had an IQ of 75, a verbal IQ of 84, and a performance IQ of 70. So not the best, but still within the normal range. 10 years later, in 2017, researchers would say that given this man's condition, it is probable that over the 30 years of his life, his brain was slowly compressed into the thin layer seen on the rim of his skull, rather than being totally missing. Next, let's talk about the case of Michelle Mark, who at 27 years of age discovered that she was missing the left hemisphere of her brain.
Michelle Mack is a woman who was born with just half a brain.
I was born missing the left hemisphere of my brain. My parents weren't given enough information because at that time there were no MRI machines, and that my brain would only progress until I was about 11 and then stop.
Doctors now believe that she had likely suffered a brain lesion from a pre-birth stroke, which resulted in the loss of nearly half her brain tissue. Now, her parents said that they had known that something was wrong shortly after her birth, and Michelle does say that she had it very difficult growing up, having a hard time controlling her emotions and understanding abstract concepts. However, she graduated from high school and now works doing data entry for her church.
I want people to see that I function on a normal level, even though there are some things that I'll never be able to do.
Dr. Jordan Grafman, the chief of the Cognitive Neuroscience section at the National Institute of Health, was the one to first diagnose the issue. He said, "We were surprised to see the extent of the lesion in her brain, which basically took away the left side of her brain. There's some very deep structures remaining, but the surface of her brain, the cortex, is 95% gone, and some of the deeper structures that control movement, are missing." However, he goes on to say that her brain has rewired itself.
We know that now that she can perform certain skills that the left hemisphere ordinarily subserves, they must now be located in the right hemisphere. So we know she's had some dramatic plasticity to enable her to have normal verbal skills, normal verbal memory.
But while we're on the subject of a missing brain hemisphere, let's talk about a hemispherectomy. Now, a hemispherectomy is a radical procedure, and it's most often done in children that suffer from drug-resistant epilepsy. It's a surgical operation to remove one hemisphere of the brain. It's an extreme surgery, and leaves patients with loss of half of the visual field in each eye, loss of an auditory center, and weakness in half of the body opposite the surgery. Now, the first hemisphere patient we'll talk about is Maura Lieb. Born in 2007, she would seem like any other child for the first few months of her life. But in early 2008, she would start to have epileptic seizures that would only become more frequent as she grew older, eventually having hundreds of them every day. She would get an MRI, and it would reveal that most of the cells in her brain's left hemisphere had died. Doctors believe that in the 3rd trimester of her mother's pregnancy, Maura had suffered a stroke to the left side of her brain. When she was 9 months old, doctors would remove her left hemisphere, and this would essentially return her mind to that of a newborn, unable to roll over, smile, and paralyzed on her right side. She would begin seeing therapists and would start to make developmental progress, walking at 23 months and being able to use full sentences at age 6. She continued to reach developmental milestones, and other than speaking and processing words slowly and being a bit weak on her right side, is basically living the same life as anyone else. Now, although this may seem like a miracle story, it's actually not as uncommon as you think. There is a population of people who have had this surgery, as it is very effective at preventing seizures, with one study showing that 65% of patients were seizure-free and half were medication-free, and no patients rating their condition as worse than before. Another study looked at the outcome of patients and saw that after a hemispherectomy, 74% improved and had significant increases in their FSIQ scores. Now, the IQ of patients who have this surgery was reported in one paper to be an average of 70. And although 70 is below the norm, there are some standouts, like the case of Christina Standhouse, who would have one of her hemispheres removed at age 8 and then would go on to earn her master's degree and become a speech pathologist, clearly having above average intelligence. All this being said, it's not everyone who is able to recover so well from this surgery. Many factors such as age, condition, remaining brain integrity, and genetics all play a part. But this does show that even missing a brain hemisphere, many people are able to live totally normal lives. Dr. Dorit Keelman, the lead researcher of this paper, even said when talking of these patients, "You can almost forget their condition when you meet them for the first time." Her study would go on to show that hemispherectomy patients had equivalent connectivity with brain regions as normal patients, and increased cross-network communication, suggesting that this could help make up for the missing tissue. A lot of cases like this are also explained by highlighting the age of people when they get this surgery. Most are very young, at an age where there is a heightened level of neurogenesis that can contribute to brain remodeling and repair. Some patients, however, won't receive this operation until they reach adulthood, and although this may lead you to believe that they would be unable to recover, the results were actually quite the opposite. Take a look at this study, which showed that even in adults, of patients who were tested with a neurocognitive assessment, 90% did not decline on anything or declined in only one measure. The final thing I want to talk about is cerebellar agenesis. This is an extremely rare condition where the cerebellum fails to develop. As we talked about earlier, this region of the brain is responsible for movement and coordination. And as you may expect, most people with this condition have a lot of issues with learning, walking, and speaking. However, there are a minority of cases with patients who appear very similar to normal brain development. First, the case of a 22-year-old man who, after a traffic accident, underwent an MRI scan. There, it was revealed that he was missing his entire left cerebellum, as well as a range of other cerebral anomalies. His mother did report that he had difficulty walking during his first 2 years, but that he had improved after the age of 6, and when compared to his peers, exhibited completely normal reading, writing, and calculating abilities. Despite all of the missing brain tissue, when he underwent neuropsychological testing, he showed only mild cognitive impairment and severe autism syndromes. In the second of these cases, a 57-year-old woman was admitted to a hospital with complaints of intermediate dizziness, which she claimed to have been experiencing over the last 15 years. She underwent an MRI, which showed a near total absence of the left cerebellum and again a range of unusual cerebral morphology. She had been working as a manual laborer and showed no abnormalities after neurological examination. Now, in both of these cases, the patient's brains showed a lot of alteration, suggesting that their neuroplasticity had relocated tasks from the cerebellum to other parts of the brain, allowing them to live such normal lives. And that's our last case. Hopefully, this gave you an insight into just how unusual and strange the brain can be. Overall, there's still a lot we don't understand, but hopefully by researching into this field, we will be better able to inform our understanding of cerebral repair and restoration, allowing for new treatments for people with brain damage. If you're interested in this sort of unusual scientific stuff, then please check out the channel. There's some wild stuff there, like research into reincarnation and human auras. Also, I recently got an X account, so follow me there for updates on new videos that will be coming out soon. Thanks for watching. Later.